In the grounds of Lincoln Castle, atop of the Lucy Tower, is a small gravestone, identical in shape to the ones around it, marked simply WC 1877. Beneath it lies the body of William Clark, the last man to be hanged at the castle. William Clark was a poacher, a bully, and an all-round bad sort, who always carried with him a stout stick to beat anyone who annoyed him. He was the leader of a gang of ruffians who obeyed him, not through love or loyalty, but through fear and loathing. Fear of his vile temper and loathing of his vicious stick. Wherever Clark went, there followed a few paces behind him his faithful dog, a skinny lurcher. It had often felt the weight of Clark's stick, and its back was scarred and bent from the beatings. Clark and his dog could often be found, if anyone wanted to find them, in the bar of the Strugglers Inn, in the shadow of the castle walls. The lean dog would squeeze itself under a chair or skulk in a tight corner, gazing nervously at its master, while Clark would lean on the bar, elbows spread, clearing a great space around him. If ever Clark's eye fell on the terrified dog, it would wag its tail frantically and yelp in a most pathetic manner, a mixture of fear and hope. Fear that Clark had taken it into his mind to beat the animal, as he often did, and hope that he might for once show some affection to the faithful animal. For in the old town this poor mistreated dog was the only living creature which cared a jot whether Clark lived or died. One evening, as Clark was drinking in the bar of the Strugglers Inn, he noticed that it had gone strangely quiet. Turning around, he was confronted by two constables who had come to arrest him over the death of a gamekeeper. Clark pulled out his trusty stick, but it was to no avail. The constables in their turn pulled out truncheons, and after a short and vicious struggle, Clark was carried, bloody and unconscious, to the gaol within the prison. Clark was indicted for murder. He had shot a gamekeeper while out poaching with his gang, and the man, after seeming to recover for a few days, had developed gangrene. The surgeons lopped off limb after limb in an attempt to save him, but he eventually died in dreadful pain a month or so later. After Clark's arrest, his gang, fearing for their safety, turned what was known as Queen's Evidence, so that after making a full confession, laying the majority of the blame on Clark, they were not prosecuted for their part in the crime. Against the confessions of his gang, Clark could make no defence. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Clark's dog now had nowhere to go, and would skulk around the walls of the castle, looking forlornly for its master. Sometimes it would scratch around the door of the Strugglers Inn and stare into the bar, expecting perhaps to find him there, but the landlord chased it away, for it reminded his customers of the loathsome villain Clark, and could not be tolerated. Indeed, it would have starved had it not been for the kindness of the landlord's wife, who gave it the odd scrap of gristle or stale bread, hiding her kind act by throwing it at the animal's head and shouting, "And I hope it chokes you." Even though public executions had long ago been abandoned, people would still gather on the morning of an execution. They would congregate first in Castle Square to watch the hangman come from his lodgings, carrying, as he always did, the little black bag, which contained the prisoner's shackles and the noose. Then they would go to the Strugglers Inn, drinking and laughing on the street outside, for here in times past it had been possible to see the hanging itself. Pie sellers and chapmen selling copies of the condemned man's last confession would do a roaring trade until a few minutes before 7 o'clock, for then a nervous silence would fall over the crowd as they imagined the scene inside the prison. The hangman entering the condemned cell, shackling the man's hands behind him. The grim procession to the new drop. The priest chanting prayers at the front, the hangman adjusting the noose at the back, and then the final moments. The hood over the head, the lever pulled, the fall, the snapping of neck bones, and the creaking of the gallows as the corpse swung slowly to and fro. The people outside were of course generally ignorant of the actual moment of death, but traditionally took the chiming of the cathedral clock as a sign that the deed was done. But that day they all knew the exact moment when the felon died, for suddenly Clark's dog, which had been sniffing around the crowd, begging for scraps, began to whimper dreadfully, its body rigid in fear, staring at the castle as if it could see through the walls, could see its master, his hands bound, stumbling, trembling, towards the gallows. At a few minutes before 7, the dog suddenly went rigid, tilted back its head, and let out such a mournful howl that it chilled the blood of every soul that heard it. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that it was this, and not the striking of the clock which marks the moment that Clark had been launched into eternity. After this eerie incident, Clark's dog became a veritable celebrity in the Bailgate, and was now as welcome in the strugglers as it had been reviled before. People would come from miles around to see Clark's amazing dog. The animal itself did not enjoy its new elevated status, however, for it looked even more miserable now that its master had gone, and grew even thinner than before, despite the landlord offering it the choicest morsels to tempt its appetite, and the wife continuing to throw rotten scraps at its head and shout, "I hope it chokes you." Eventually the poor animal died, but the landlord, not wishing to lose such an attraction, had it stuffed and displayed behind the bar for many years. The spirit of the dog could not rest, and it had haunted the walls of the castle for many years. Sometimes it returned to the strugglers' inn at midnight, and the landlord and landlady would lie terrified in their beds as they heard the scratching and whining of the ghostly dog at their front door. Many years passed, the landlord and landlady had long gone. Even the story of Clark and his amazing dog had faded from the memory of Lincoln folk. Occasionally there was a scratching sound at midnight, but the new landlord of the Strugglers' Inn paid no attention to it, thinking it was probably rats, and the old stuffed dog in the bar, dusty and decayed now, one glass eye missing, was thrown away. Yet occasionally, on dark and stormy nights, late revellers still see the figure of that skinny dog lurking beneath the castle walls. It tilts back its head and opens its mouth and lets out such a dreadful mournful howl that it chills the blood of the drunkard, filling his heart with such dread that he goes home a sober, sadder man. On a cold night, on the anniversary of her brutal death, a young woman may be seen falling from the roof of Doddington Hall, screaming. In an attempt to escape her lustful master, she apparently lost her footing and plunged to her death in the midst of a chase. Today, though, this spectre is seen far less than the Brown Lady. If you are a newly married woman, it is probably best that you don't visit the hall for a while. The Brown Lady is said to haunt new brides in particular, but seems to be quite a harmless apparition,
She apparently materialises in one of the bedrooms while the bride is alone and sits smiling at the woman, as if giving her blessings or remembering the first few happy days of her own marriage. She is said to be wearing an old-fashioned, long, stiff brown dress. She is never seen for more than a few seconds, and is apparently not a scary ghost. In fact, some of the haunted women have said it made them feel much more at peace. The building of Doddington Hall began in about 1593, and the hall was finished in 1600. It was built by Robert Smithson, who also built Wallerton Hall in Nottingham and Ardwick Hall in Derbyshire. In the mid-1700s, the building was inherited by John Delaval, who redesigned much of the hall quite drastically into a more Georgian style, although he kept the outside of the hall the same as it was when it was originally built. The hall has never been sold for the last 400 years, and today it is the family home of the Birches, who inherited the house through the generations. The family name having changed several times because of women inheriting the building. The Birches devote their work to the upkeep of the house and gardens, preserving as much as possible the original features of the house, as well as encouraging visitors to the house and gardens. Now, this is a personal experience of somebody that went to the hall in the dark. At twilight, I arrived at the hall, parked across the road, and made my way towards the magnificent building. Although it was out of opening hours, the front gates remained open, so I wandered through them to get a closer look. The sun was sinking rapidly behind the building, and its silhouette looked glorious against the skyline. A sharp movement caught my eye in the nearby garden, and I turned around as quickly as possible. A squirrel. The animal ran away from me and into a nearby bush. Whether it was the time of day at which I had come to the building, the quaint surroundings, or the homely feel of the place, I found that I was less scared of this haunted building than any other I had visited. In fact, I felt quite at peace with the place, as if nothing bad would or could happen there. I wandered down the drive to the back of the building and found more smaller buildings around here, which had evidently been renovated into other family homes. I also found that I could go no further around the back of the place because I was face to face on that side with a high brick wall. Noticing that somebody appeared to be in one of the upper rooms, I plucked up my courage and knocked to try and speak to who I could. I can only assume was one of the house owners. This was to no avail though. I stood for a couple of minutes staring at the old wooden door before beginning the trek back up the long drive towards my own car. Sadly for me, nothing supernatural happened on this journey whatsoever, and even if it had, I find it hard to believe that it would have been at all scary in such a tranquil setting. But perhaps a reader may have a better experience to tell of. So that's some of the information that I've read out about Doddington Hall. That's just one person's experience there.
Tom Otter lived in the county in the early 1800s. His story begins when he met a young girl called Mary Kirkham. The two became very close, and then Mary eventually gave birth to Tom Otter's child. The laws of the day stated that Tom must either marry her or go to jail, despite the fact that he was already married. On the 3rd of November 1805, Tom took her to be his wife. That night, while they walked home together, Tom killed Mary with a hedge stake. It was not long before the murder was discovered, and Tom Otter was arrested and charged. He was sentenced to death at a trial which took place at the Sun Inn, Saxelby. Mary Kirkham's body was found in the lane and was also taken to the Sun Inn. As the body was brought in, blood spilled onto the steps of the inn. This blood was said to have stained the steps for many years after the murder took place, no matter what attempts were made to clean them. On the 14th of March 1806, Tom Otter was hanged, and then the body was fastened in irons and hung upon a high post. Even this event was surrounded by tragedy. The body fell from the post twice due to the weight of the irons, and upon falling the second time, crushed one of the men and killed him. The stake with which Tom Otter killed Mary was kept for many years. Every year on the night that the murder took place, the stake would be removed from wherever it was being kept. Many attempts were made to secure it using iron hoops or staples, but nothing was found that could hold it. The following morning, it would be found in the spot where the murder took place and would be wet with gore. No one knew what or who was moving the stake, and it was eventually burned by the Bishop of Lincoln in the yard outside the cathedral. An article appeared in the Lincolnshire Chronicle a week following publication of the tale. A series of articles entitled Sketches of Country Life by Thomas Miller have recently been commenced in the columns of the Lincoln Times, and number 2 relates to Drisney Nook near Saxelby and the murder of Tom Otter. The article is of such an extraordinary character, so full of manifest absurdities and so perverse to the true fact, that it has caused more than a fair share of attention. The Saxelby people, who are well acquainted with the story, are indignant and condemn in strong terms what they say is a mass of falsehood and superstition. Lincoln people, on the other hand, laugh at the nonsense, fully understanding how the author of the sketch has drawn largely on his imagination for the purposes of exciting the wonderment and pandering to the superstitious ideas of that large class of rural population who yet believe in ghosts, hobgoblins and witches. Ghost hunters still visit the Sun Inn in pursuit of a tale from a Victorian author. Thomas Otter, christened at Treswell on 3rd of March 1782, was the son of Thomas and Anne Temple. He married Martha Rawlinson in Eckering, Nottinghamshire, sometime during 1804. Their daughter Mary was christened on the 23rd of December 1804 in Ockerton, 6 miles north of Southwell. During 1805, Otter was working in Lincoln, but under an alias, by using his mother's maiden name of Temporal. Contemporary newspaper articles describe Tom as a stout, handsome man, about 5 feet 9 inches high, and describe his occupation as a labouring banker upon one of the canals in the neighbourhood of Lincoln. John S. Percy, in his History of Retford, written in 1828, describes Otter as malicious and revengeful and cruel to horses and other animals. Newspaper reports continue he became criminally intimate with a young woman, and she proving pregnant, he was compelled by the parish officers to marry her. No one involved was aware that he was already married. The Bastardy Act of 1733 stipulated that the supposed father was responsible for the maintenance of his illegitimate child. If he failed to support the child, the mother could have him arrested on a justice warrant and put in prison until he agreed to do so. Parishes were obliged to maintain the mother and her child until the father could do so. Those parishes were to be reimbursed by the alleged father, though this rarely happened. In an attempt to stem the rising costs of poor relief, the local authorities attempted to reduce their liability for illegitimate children by forcing the fathers to marry the mothers. This was known as a knobstick wedding, the forerunner of a shotgun wedding. It is far from clear what happened following the wedding, but for some reason Tom and Mary found their way to Drisney Nook, an area on the Nottinghamshire-Saxby border, along the A57. The body of a woman was found the following morning, her head being beaten to a pulp, and a large hedge stake with 2 bundles of cloths lying near her. Tom Otter was arrested by Patchy White, a Lincoln constable, later in the day at the Packhorse Inn in Lincoln High Street. He was escorted the following day to Saxilby for the inquest on Mary. Immediately following the inquest, Mary was buried in the churchyard of St. Botolph, Saxilby, by Thomas Rees, Vicar of Saxilby. The tale of a man who murdered his pregnant wife on their wedding night on the 3rd of November 1805 still endures. The story has been faithfully reproduced over the years. You can find the same version widely on the internet. And ghost hunters regularly visit the Sun Inn at Saxilby, where the inquest was held. But how much of the story is folk tale? We've just been through that, haven't we? So how much of it is real and how much of it isn't? I'm not too sure. But the story is definitely endured. So, yep. And as you can see that I'm walking, I'm right near the Sun Inn, looking through the windows. And everyone keeps wondering what I'm doing. So yeah. As you can see, there's kids there as well. And it's packed out in there. So yes, I think that's about it for the story of the Sun Inn and Tom Otter. So hopefully you enjoyed that. I've only just begun this. So yeah, I'll be doing more stories. And we'll just see how it goes. Right, okay everyone. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back on here again soon. Right, thank you. Hello everyone. So tonight I'll be reading out a traditional ghost story from Lincolnshire, and it's called Mother Nightshade of Gedney. No one ever went by old Mother Nightshade's cottage after dark, for it was said she was a witch, and if anyone did, they would return home deranged or mad, if they returned at all. But one man summoned up the courage to visit Mother Nightshade. John Culpeper. John Culpeper had fallen madly in love with Rose Taylor, the prettiest girl in the town, but was having little luck in wooing her. He found any excuse to pass her house in the evening, but if he ever met her, he found he was too afraid to speak to her. So he would walk straight on, muttering curses at himself for his shyness. This had the opposite effect on Rose to that which John would have liked, for his lurking about and muttering made her think he was a little simple in the head. It was in the week before the village fair that John decided he must screw up his courage and approach Rose, for the fair was a famous place for courting, and he feared some other lad might woo her. He waited one morning under a pretty blossoming tree, as romantic a spot as he could imagine, and when Rose came past, he greeted her, saying how pretty she looked. With a gallant action, he reached to pluck a bunch of pretty pink blossom for her. Unfortunately, it had been a cold night, and the tree was heavy with dew. As John tugged at the flowers, he sent down a torrent of water onto Rose's head. "You idiot," she cried, and went on dripping wet. As if this was not bad enough, the following week at the fair, Rose pointed him out to her friends and told her about their meeting, and they all laughed. Humiliated, John went home on the verge of tears. So it was the following evening that John made his way apprehensively to old Mother Nightshade's cottage. He crept up the path and knocked on the door, half expecting that she would come out and scream at him, for she had a dreadful reputation in the village. He was rather surprised when she answered the door and invited him into her house, bidding him to sit down and make himself comfortable while she brewed some tea. She was, she said, lonely on a night, and always welcomed company. She asked John to tell her about his problems, and with a cup of tea in hand, he began his story. He told her about his feelings for Rose Taylor, how he had tried to put himself in a position to see her, but was too shy to talk, how their meeting had gone so disastrously wrong, and how she had mocked him at the fair. And he told her how his feelings had changed, how he wanted revenge. Old Mother Nightshade smiled at John, saying she had the very thing, and pressing into his hand a little wooden box sealed with a red ribbon, told him to give it to her on her birthday. Not directly, but in a way that she would be sure that it was from him. Now it happened that Rose's birthday fell 3 days after John's visit to the witch, and on the day John walked through the town with the box in his hands, taking great care to greet everyone he passed and make sure they noticed what he was carrying. He made his way to Rose's house, allowing the gate to slam as he went up the garden, and left the box with a little posy of blossom on the doorstep. Then he walked back up the path noisily, kicking the gravel before him, and slammed the gate again, confident that the girl must surely find out who had given her the box. Rose was delighted by the box, for it was filled with the most delicious chocolate she had ever tasted. A few enquiries soon revealed to her who had sent them. Rose looked at the well-made box, the pretty red ribbon, and as she chewed thoughtfully on a delicious chocolate, she smiled. The next day, as John was walking down the road, what did he see but Rose, standing under the same blossom tree where they had met a week or so before. She was waiting for him. Rose smiled warmly at John, hoping he would stop to court her, but he didn't stop. He kept on walking, and though he smiled back at her, it was a smile of triumph. Rose made her way home again, puzzled. That evening John returned to old Mother Nightshade's cottage and told her that he was sure that Rose knew that he had sent her the box, and how she had waited for him, hoping that he would talk to her. His eyes gleamed maliciously as he asked what was to happen next. How was his revenge on the girl to come about? The old woman said nothing for a few minutes, peering at the young man, shaking her head. Finally she told him that she would reveal the revenge to him if he wanted, but he must do exactly as she said. She took from her cupboard a length of rope and tied John's hands to the arm of the chair, saying it was necessary, then bound his feet the same. In the growing gloom she lit 2 candles and placed them on the mantelpiece. Then she turned to John, her eyes flaming with anger. "You fool," she screamed. "Did you think I would help you to harm that young maid? I was once like her, young, pretty, ill-treated by an oaf like you. I gave you the chance to woo her fair and square. I gave you some chocolates for her, but you just want revenge for your hurt feelings. Well, now I will dispose of your future forever." And slowly, as poor John watched, old Mother Nightshade turned into a slavering, sharp-fanged wolf. All through the night the people of Gedney heard dreadful howls and groans from old Mother Nightshade's cottage, but no one dared to investigate. Instead, they double-locked the doors and pulled their bedclothes tightly round their ears. In the morning, a few brave souls went to the cottage and found inside the mangled remains of John Culpepper, bitten and torn by sharp teeth, and all around the floor were the bloody paw prints of a wolf. The vicar, of course, did not believe any of the tales he was told about Mother Nightshade and her shape-twisting, and John was buried quietly without fuss. But the villagers knew, for they burned down her cottage and would not even walk over the land where it had stood for many, many years. Mother Nightshade was never seen again, at least not in Gedney. As for Rose, she married a young farmer later in the same year, and he, perhaps wisely, treated her very, very well, and they lived happily ever after.
Hello everyone. So now I'll be reading out a story of the murder of Sweet Fanny Adams, 1867. In 1867, the bricklayer George Adams lived in a cottage at 141 Tanhouse Lane, Alton, with his wife Harriet and their 6 children. Fanny Adams, the 4th of these children, had been born in 1859. Described as a tall, comely and intelligent girl, she was known for her lively, cheerful disposition. On Saturday, the 24th of August, 1867, a fine and sunny day, Fanny Adams, her younger sister Lizzie, and their friend Minnie Warner wanted to go for a stroll to the Flood Meadows nearby. Mrs. Adams had no objection to them going out, since the small Hampshire town of Alton
was considered a particularly safe and quiet place to live. In fact, there had been no serious crime there within living memory. As the three little girls were walking towards the flood meadows, they chanced to meet a neatly dressed young man, Solicitor's Clerk Frederick Baker. He was well known to be a friend of little children, and he often spoke to them and gave them money to buy sweets. And indeed, the Bonimus Baker produced 1.50, which he gave to Minnie Warner and Lizzie Adams to buy sweets, and then he gave Fanny an halfpenny. The girls knew Baker, who stood quietly watching them as they played and ate berries. Then he suddenly and wordlessly picked up Fanny Adams and made off with her. The other two girls ran home, but were unable to tell an adult what had just happened. Instead, they carried on playing until the neighbour, Mrs. Gardner, came and asked them where Fanny was. When she heard that Fanny had been carried off by a man, she and Mrs. Adams made their way to the flood meadows, where they saw Frederick Baker skulking near a gate separating the meadows from the hop garden. When Minnie Warner, whom the two women had taken with them, saw him, she identified him as the man who had given her the money and taken off with Fanny. When they asked him what he had done with Fanny, he denied taking her, although he admitted giving the children some money to buy sweets. When the indignant Mrs. Gardner exclaimed, "I have a great mind to give you in charge of the police," he suddenly replied that she could do so if she liked. Since both Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Adams knew Frederick Baker was supposed to be a respectable man, they were reluctant to challenge him any further. Perhaps the other children were wrong, and perhaps Fanny had left them to go playing elsewhere, they hoped. The two women went home, but after Fanny had not returned home by 7 p.m, they alerted the neighbours and a search was made in the hop garden. One of the neighbours was aghast to find Fanny's head stuck on 2 hop poles. One of the ears had been cut off, both eyes had been gouged out, and the murderer had cut her from mouth to ear and across the temple. Shouting with horror and alarm, the Alton countrymen found parts of Fanny strewn all over the hop garden and nearby fields. Her arms and legs had been cut off, and her abdomen and pelvis disemboweled. Various internal organs were scattered on the ground, although the heart, sternum and vagina were never found. When Harriet Adams heard what had happened to Fanny, she became frantic and rushed off to tell her husband, who was playing cricket in a field, but she collapsed on the way and was taken back home by the neighbours. When informed that his daughter had been murdered and dismembered, George Adams grabbed hold of a loaded shotgun and went into the hop garden to look for the creature Baker, but he returned home without having found him. The local police were called at the very same evening. Superintendent Shaney arrested the main suspect, Frederick Baker, in the solicitor's office. There was an uproar in Alton. News of the horrible murder spread like wildfire, and a hostile mob followed Baker all the way to the police station. He had been drinking in a pub nearby and had told the other pub visitors that he was going to leave town for good. When his fellow clerk, Morris Biddle, remarked that he might find it difficult to get another job, he answered ironically, considering what he had just accomplished, that he could always go as a butcher. Baker's shirt and trousers were stained with blood, and 2 small blood-stained knives were found on him. Then there was the matter of his office diary, containing the extraordinary note, 24th of August, Saturday, killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. Frederick Baker was a short, thin, 29-year-old man of cadaverous appearance. His parents had been respectable, God-fearing people who had provided him with a good education. Before he came to Alton, he had worked in Guildford, where he had been a member of 2 literary societies, secretary to the Guildford Institute Debating Society, an active member of the Penny Savings Bank, and a Sunday school teacher. He began to drink, however, and was ousted from his position at the Debating Society. He wanted to marry the lady's maid of a certain Mrs. Aidan, but some mean-spirited person wrote a poison pen letter to her, detailing all Baker's shortcomings, and the engagement was broken. After this, his drinking and dissipation grew worse. It was said that he had once been under suspicion for having lured a little girl into a disused chalk pit for felonious purposes, but the matter had been hushed up by his family and friends, and the girl's family soon left town. After coming to Alton, Frederick Baker did his work at the solicitor's office in a relatively conscientious manner, although his hard drinking continued. He was a familiar sight at the local beerhouses. Some people thought him quite odd. He had a mania for various gluttonous exploits, like devouring large pork pies and drinking bottle after bottle of stout, or eating a number of uncooked pork sausages. Nevertheless, he had no police record prior to the murder of Fanny Adams. The coroner's inquest on Fanny Adams was opened at the Duke's Head Tavern in Alton on 27th of August. Minnie Warner was old enough to be the first witness and described the ill-fated outing to the Flood Meadows. A number of people described the ghoulish hunt for body parts in the Hop Garden, and Morris Biddle recalled his sinister conversation with Frederick Baker the evening of the murder. Dr. Lewis Leslie thought that Fanny Adams had been struck down with a large stone before being dismembered with a sharp knife. Professor Taylor, the London analyst, could verify that Baker's clothes and knives were stained with mammalian blood. The inquest returned a verdict of murder against Frederick Baker, and the local magistrates committed him to stand trial at the Winchester Assizes. A large mob had congregated outside the police station, and they booed and hooted at Baker. Several police constables were struck by objects thrown by this rowdy crowd. Frederick Baker stood trial for murder at the Winchester Assizes in the Great Hall of the Old Castle on the 5th and 6th of December 1867. The court was full of spectators, and a large mob waited outside. Since the horrible nature of the murder of innocent little Fanny Adams had caused widespread anger and revulsion, every newspaper in the country reported its outcome. Minnie Warner was given a large doll to keep her occupied during the long, dreary trial. Since the evidence against Frederick Baker seemed rock solid, the only thing the defence could try was to play the insanity card. His father testified that as a young man, Baker had suffered from nosebleeds and headaches, and that he had always looked on him as being weak-minded. The father had himself had insane tendencies. A cousin had been in an asylum 4 times, and a sister had died from brain fever. The problem was that although several people in Guildford and Alton had disapproved of Baker's frequent drunkenness, few had found him obviously insane, and he had been fully capable of looking after his job. The jury was wholly unimpressed with the
exhortations of the defence, and Frederick Baker was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. He was hanged at the Winchester County Gaol on the 24th of December in front of a crowd of more than 6,000 people, none of whom seemed any worse for this singular Christmas entertainment. Before the execution, Frederick Baker had written to Fanny's parents confessing his guilt. All of a sudden, he had got a strong impulse to seal away and murder the little girl. He had been enraged by her crying, but had done her to death without any struggle. He vehemently denied having violated the child. A headstone for Fanny Adams was erected in the local cemetery in the old Adilum Road by public subscription. A tall, handsome stone shaped like a cross, it bears the inscription, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August the 24th, 1867. Fear not them that kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." The quote from Matthew, of course, makes a choice prediction concerning the fate of Baker in the afterlife. There was a cabinet card photograph with the two girls, Minnie Warner and Lizzie Adams, standing by Fanny's gravestone. It is today quite a rarity and much sought after by collectors of criminal memorabilia. The murder of Fanny Adams caused considerable public concern. The contemporary newspaper reports concentrated on the youth and innocence of the victim and the extreme brutality of the murderer. Everyone living in England at the time would have known the name of Sweet Fanny Adams. 2 years after the murder, in 1869, tins of mutton were introduced into the rations of the Royal Navy. With grisly nautical humour, the sailors likened these unappetising lumps of meat and gristle to the butchered remains of poor Fanny. Indeed, Fanny Adams became a naval slang word for mutton or mutton stew, and a naval mess tin or cooking pot is still referred to as a fanny. It was not until later that Sweet Fanny Adams came to mean nothing. The term fuck all has long been with us with that meaning, although how long is not clear, as politeness caused it not to be recorded in print until the 20th century. The coincidence of Fanny Adams' initials caused FA or Fanny Adams to be used as a euphemism for fuck all. It is sad but true that this uncouth linguistic oddity is today all that the blameless young Alton murder victim is remembered by. Right, okay, so I've just done this one story, short story, just to see how it works out. And yeah, so we'll just see how these work out. So thanks for watching, everyone. Listening. And I'll be back on here again soon. Right, thank you. Good night.